In this lesson, you're going to learn about one of the most important parts of an LBO model, which is the debt schedules. Now, the reason why the debt schedules in an LBO model are so important is because if you think about what we've done so far, everything we've done to this point, we've created a projected cash flow statement, a projected income statement. We skipped the balance sheet, but we could have done that as well. The problem is that other than some of the assumptions we made here at the top with debt and sources and uses, for example, there isn't a whole lot here that's dramatically different from our three-statement model over here. We're doing basically the same thing. We're making the same projections. We are creating these three statements, tying them together, making sure everything is linked properly. And really, with an LBO itself is not that much different from a three-statement model, a normal model that you would create for a company. The difference lies in the fact that at the beginning of an LBO model, you're taking on a certain amount of debt, and then you're assuming that you're paying off a certain portion of it over time. So to actually track how much debt we're paying off over time, and also track how much interest we're paying on the debt, and how much interest we're earning on cash over that same time period, we need to create a debt and interest schedule, as I've labeled it right here. So our basic approach here will be to first look at the bank debt that a company takes on, and then we're going to look at the high yield debt that Apple takes on. In the first example with bank debt, I'm going to go through and show you how to set up all the formulas, and then you'll get some practice on your own setting up the formulas for the high yield debt in the second part. So to start with, our starting point for the debt schedules here will be the beginning bank debt and high yield debt balances. As with the cash flow statement, we do not care at all about the historical numbers. We only care about what's going to happen in future years here. So for the beginning bank debt, I'm going to go all the way up to the debt schedules near the top and pull in the bank debt from there. For the high yield debt, I'm going to do the same thing and just go all the way up to the top to the debt schedules. And so we have those. Now the next step here, at least for the bank debt, is to figure out what the mandatory repayment is each year. Mandatory repayment is just referring to when we take out debt, certain terms of the debt provision say that we have to repay a certain amount of the principal each year. How much do we actually have to repay from 2010 through 2014 here? So for this one, you might remember that up at the top, we made some assumptions about this. We said that 10% of the bank debt would have to be repaid each year. So your instinct here might be to just say, for this formula, you can just take the 10% times the initial bank debt balance right here. So we have to repay roughly $8 billion worth of bank debt each year. However, there are a couple problems with this. First off, I want to change this to a negative sign because we're repaying debt here, which is going to decrease our bank debt balance. The other problem with this formula is that we have a problem when, for example, our bank debt balance is down to a very low number. So let's say after 3 or 4 years here, we're down to only $5 billion worth of debt. Well, if we only have $5 billion worth of debt left, but we're repaying the same amount each year, then we're going to overpay and we're going to lose cash attempting to pay a loan that no longer exists. So what we need to do instead is do a check here and use the minimum function, and we're going to repay either the minimum of the yearly repayment amount or the beginning bank debt balance. So by using this formula, we're saying that if the minimum repayment each year, the 10% times the initial bank debt balance, if that is less than the amount of debt we currently have, just repay that number. On the other hand, if that exceeds our current debt balance, so if our current debt balance is less than our yearly repayment total, then we're going to repay the entire loan and our loan will be gone after that. So that's all this formula is saying. Another thing we want to do here is anchor these L31 and L28 cells with F4. That's just to prevent them from shifting around when we copy it across. Now, for the optional repayment here, so remember above that we saw with Apple's cash flow available for debt repayment, or rather cash available for debt repayment here, we have around $14 billion that they can use to repay debt. But currently they're only spending about $8 billion on this mandatory debt repayment. Also remember that with bank debt, we're actually allowed to make prepayments on it. So we don't actually have to save everything to the end as we do with high yield debt. But instead, if we have extra cash, we can actually allocate that cash to repay debt right here instead. So your instinct here for the formula would be to take the cash available for debt repayment and then simply subtract how much we've already repaid, the mandatory repayment. We can also add a negative sign in front of this. And so what we can do then is simply sum up everything. We see that our debt has decreased here by the amount of cash that was available for debt repayment. The problem, though, with this optional debt repayment formula is similar to what we saw with the mandatory debt repayment formula, which is that what happens if the cash available for debt repayment plus the mandatory repayment, what if the amount that's left after that is greater than this beginning bank debt balance? If that's the case, then we have a problem. Because what will happen then is, let's say we have 15 billion of cash available for debt repayment. We have a bank debt balance of 5 billion and we're repaying everything. Well, what this formula will then do is say that we can repay optionally 10 billion, but that's wrong because we only have 5 billion of bank debt left. So what we need to do instead is once again use the min formula. So I'm going to have negative min, and I'm going to take our beginning bank debt balance and then subtract, or rather add, because it has a negative sign, the mandatory debt repayment right here. So this formula ensures that we're either going to take whatever's left of the debt and repay that optionally, or if there's so much left that it's much greater than our cash flow and the cash available, then we're only going to use the cash available to optionally repay part of the debt. So we have that, and we see that in this case it doesn't really change anything at all. The final thing I want to do here before copying these formulas across is make sure that beginning bank debt from year 2 onward is linked to our ending bank debt balance in year 1. So with all that in place, now I'm just going to copy these formulas across, the first set right here. And so we've copied this across now, and we see that according to this model now, we've paid off all the bank debt by year 3. Of course, that is not really correct because we have not yet entered the cash used for debt repayment here. So we'll come back to that later. But at least for now, this model appears to be working under the data that we currently have. And once again, the basic idea here, I know the formula, especially for the optional repayment, may get a little tricky, but the basic idea here is simple, that we have to repay a certain part of this each year, and then if we happen to have extra cash left over, then we can devote some of that cash to paying off even more, assuming that we're dealing with bank debt here. So that's how bank debt works. What I want you to do for your exercise now is to do the same thing, but for high yield debt now. And remember that for high yield debt, there is no optional repayment. The reason is because, again, with high yield debt, everything is due at the end. Prepayment is not allowed, so you cannot allocate extra cash flow to repaying high yield debt here. So go through and fill in the beginning formula, the mandatory repayment formula, optional repayment, which will just be 0, and then the ending high yield debt formulas. Go in and model it after what we've done here for the beginning bank debt through the ending bank debt formulas, and see if you can figure it out yourself for this one. So pause this video right now, give it a shot yourself, and then when you're done, you can unpause it and we'll walk through this together. Okay, good. So here's what we're going to do for high yield debt now. So for the mandatory repayment formula, this is almost the same as what we had for the bank debt one. We're just going to take negative min of the high yield debt right here times the high yield principal repayment percentage, which is 0% here. So that will be one possibility, and then the other possibility will be that we repay the entire high yield debt balance right here. We're also going to anchor those two formulas for the annual repayment. Now for the optional repayment, this is very easy because remember, high yield debt cannot be repaid early. You cannot have any prepayment on it. So for year 1 here, I'm going to enter 0. And then what I'm going to do is just sum up everything here. And we see that unlike bank debt, in year 1 at least, our high yield debt balance is not changing. And this is pretty much always what happens in LBO models like this with any kind of high yield debt. The balance will generally not change unless you have some type of more complex debt instrument. With high yield debt, it's pretty much going to stay the same all the way until repayment. So now to copy this formula across, let's make sure the beginning high yield debt balance is linked to the ending one the year before. For optional repayment, we're going to link to the 0 number. For mandatory repayment, we can copy and paste that formula, and we can copy and paste the sum formula as well. With all that in place, let's just copy this across now. And so we have our high yield schedule right here. So now that we figured out how bank debt and high yield debt change from year to year, or how they don't change in the case of high yield debt, what we need to do is figure out how much interest we're actually paying and then how much interest we're earning on cash. So for the interest paid on debt, we're going to express this as a negative once again. And what we want to do here is take the average of the beginning bank debt balance and then the ending bank debt balance and multiply it by the bank debt interest rate. So we're going to go up to the top to debt assumptions. I'm going to anchor that one because we want the bank debt interest rate to stay the same. And then we're going to also use a negative and average up the high yield debt right here and multiply that by the high yield debt interest rate, anchoring that once again. So we have that in place. One point I would make here is that by taking the average balances here, we are creating a circular reference in our model. Because if you think about it, when we average the beginning debt and ending bank debt, well, the ending bank debt is going to depend on how much interest we paid. Because if we've paid more interest here, then we're not going to be able to repay quite as much bank debt. If we've paid less interest, we'll be able to repay more bank debt. So by having this average formula with beginning and ending balances, we are introducing a circular reference in our model. This is not a huge problem, and as long as when you go to Alt-TO and go to formulas, this is in Excel 2007, as long as you have enable iterative calculations checked, you should be fine. But this is just something I wanted to raise, that we are introducing an added complexity here by averaging the beginning and ending debt balances. Now for the interest earned on cash, we're going to take a similar approach. So we're going to average the beginning cash balance and then the ending cash balance and multiply by our effective cash interest rate above. We're not going to anchor this one because we want this one to be able to shift around and change from year to year. But remember, we have an added complexity here because it's not just the cash balance on Apple's balance sheet that's actually earning interest here. Going back to our three-statement model, remember that in our interest calculation for interest income right here, we're actually, if you press F2, we're actually figuring in short-term securities and long-term securities as well. Fortunately for us, both of those numbers stay the same from year to year. So to make this easy on us, to actually make this calculation, all we have to do here is add in the average of those numbers from our three-statement model right here. So we're going to average short-term securities plus long-term securities from in 2009, and then short-term plus long-term in 2010. And we're going to multiply once again by our effective cash interest rate up here. So now we have around 418 million worth of interest income here. Once again, I'm going to copy this across. We see that overall the interest earned on cash is going up by quite a bit each year, and the interest paid on debt is going down as the debt is paid off. For the net numbers, we're just going to add these up. So the net interest income or expense right here. So we have that. The last thing I want to do here before going back and linking everything together is for the cash used for debt repayment. I just want to make sure that we have the mandatory and optional repayments for everything right here, for both bank debt and high yield debt. I'm adding in high yield debt because potentially in the future we could change around this model to support more than just bank debt and high yield debt, so we want to be flexible and include everything in our calculation. So now we have that in place, and we see that in each year here, our entire cash balance available for debt repayment is actually being used for debt repayment. And so with that done, our debt and interest schedules are now in place. This is definitely the most complex part of any LBO model, and it can actually get a lot more complex than what we have here. This is just a very simple version, but if you can understand everything we just went through, you should have a good grasp on the basic idea behind such a schedule and how to set one up even in a more complex model. There are always additions we could make. One thing that comes to mind is with this mandatory debt number right here, you might have wondered, well, what happens if our mandatory debt repayment exceeds the cash available for debt repayment right here? What would happen in that scenario? And that's a good question. What would happen there is that the company would actually have to take on additional debt, something called a revolver. We're not going to get into that here, but basically when a company has a shortfall in its cash flow, it would have to raise additional debt. So that's something we'll look at in the more advanced model, but that is one thing that could go wrong. And there are lots of other details here. We could make adjustments and have a different interest rate each year on the two tranches of debt. We could come up with more different types of debt. We are only looking at bank debt and high yield debt here, but again, for understanding the basics of an LBO model, and even for many types of private equity interviews, this is often all you need, just a fundamental understanding of these types of concepts. Coming up next, we're going to be finishing our work on this model by linking together our statements, filling in some of the loose ends, tying everything together, and making sure that we have a fully functional LBO model.